Laudetur Jesus Christus. Es tut mir leid, aber ich spreche nicht Deutsch. I am very pleased to have been asked to participate in this 18th Cologne International Liturgical Conference and to speak on one of my favorite topics, namely the Sacred Liturgy. I am most grateful to the organizers of this event, not only for their kindness to me personally, but more importantly, for the ongoing work toward an authentic renewal of the Sacred Liturgy. I am firmly of the mind that if we do not get the liturgy right, we will continue to experience many of the other problems in our common ecclesial life. I speak to you today not as a scholar, but as a pastor of the church. My postgraduate work was in canon law, not in sacred liturgy. I do not consider myself a liturgical scholar. I have studied, however, the current state of affairs in the church regarding the sacred liturgy, and I have immersed myself in an appreciation of the liturgical reform that took place before, but especially after, the Second Vatican Council. I lived and experienced that reform. Now, as a bishop of the church, I have my own perspective concerning from where we have come and to where we still need to go. I am going to frame my presentation this morning in terms of my own personal experience of the reform of the sacred liturgy that took place in the United States of America in the wake of Vatican II. I know this may sound too personal and perhaps not as universal to some, but my experience was the experience of many, if not most, of the people throughout these years. Following an explanation of my own experience, I will share some perceptions of what is happening in North America regarding the ongoing liturgical renewal in the light of the tradition of the Roman liturgy. We need to understand the history of what happened before we can fully appreciate what is happening now regarding a rediscovery of tradition in the sacred liturgy. Before launching into the heart of my presentation, I wish to make a very important point. I have gained a reputation for being devoted to a more traditional experience of the sacred liturgy, not just in the extraordinary form, but in the ordinary form as well. And I want to emphasize that this does not come from a place of sentimentality or a nostalgia for the past. I am a complete product of the Second Vatican Council, never having consciously experienced the traditional liturgy as a young person. I am the first bishop in the United States born in the 1960s, 1960 to be precise. So what I have to say comes from my own deepening appreciation for our liturgical tradition, beginning with my years as a secular university student down to the present day. I've decided to begin with an experience that I had as a young secondary school student in about 1977, 1978, when I was only 17 years old. I was attending a Catholic school at the time, and we were having a day of recollection at the campus ministry center at a local secular university. When it came time for Mass, the priest gathered us all around a coffee table, seated in a circle. He proceeded with celebrating the Mass, seated at the table with us. The bread for the Eucharist was leavened bread and placed in a simple basket with a napkin enfolded. The chalice was made of pottery. It was a very casual experience, with great emphasis being placed on the meal dimension of the Holy Eucharist. At the time, it was considered to be a very relevant way of celebrating the Mass that would appeal to young people. It left me very much unimpressed. I had almost completely forgotten about this experience until the year 2008. I was at that time learning to celebrate the extraordinary form of the Roman Liturgy. Pope Benedict XVI had issued Summorum Pontificum, and as a bishop of the Church, I thought it was my duty to learn how to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. I was so deeply impressed with the solemnity, beauty, and reverence of the traditional Mass. And I wondered what had happened in the liturgical renewal after Vatican II. How could we have gone so quickly from this way of celebrating Holy Mass to what I experienced at that school Mass just 10 years or more later? Something had clearly gone wrong. I began serving Mass just as the Missal of Blessed Paul VI was coming into force. Before that, I had not paid much attention to the rites associated with the Mass. But now, I was observing the liturgical changes up close. I remember, as a young person, being very confused by the changes that were happening. It seemed like every week there was something new happening at Mass, some new change or innovation. And then the strange and unapproved experimentation and innovations began to happen. Creativity was the rule of the day, and it seemed like anything was possible in molding the liturgy to our own personal ideas and desires. One of the most disturbing changes taking place was with regard to sacred music. Popular songs from the secular world were making their way into the liturgy. I could tell you many stories of disturbing accommodations of secular tunes into the Mass. If secular songs themselves did not make it into the sacred liturgy, the style, at least, of the secular music began to shape more and more the future of sacred song in the Mass. As long as the words spoke about God and faith, it seemed then like any style of music was acceptable. You know, in the United States, we had the famous rock Mass with drums, bass guitars. With the combination of liturgical experimentation, the decline in quality and sacredness of music for the liturgy, and liturgical abuses, the sacred liturgy quickly drifted away from its sacred tradition. In a sense, the liturgy had been shaken from its foundation and had developed at a surprisingly rapid rate, so that it no longer resembled at all the Mass as it had been celebrated and experienced for most of the Church's history. In my experience and estimations, there had been a rupture with the past. Instead of developing with a hermeneutic of continuity, as described by Pope Benedict XVI, the sacred liturgy was almost unrecognizable with what had gone before, at least as it was celebrated in much of the United States during this time. To be sure, there were pockets of fidelity to tradition, but these were sadly the exception. Now, to be clear, I am not one who attributes the general rupture with tradition to the Second Vatican Council, specifically the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium. It was not the Council documents themselves that led to a disappointing liturgical reform. Those responsible for its implementation went, in my mind, well beyond what the Council Fathers had really asked for. I once had a disagreement with a brother bishop when I made this very point. And he said, "But this is the Mass that the Council gave us." I disagreed strongly and pointed out that I believe that most of the Council Fathers would not recognize what had happened to the Mass compared to what they had voted for at the Council. We all know the story. Nowhere did the Council call for the turning around of the altar to face away from liturgical east, the direction associated with Christ and His return in glory. Nowhere did the Council call for the destruction of communion rails, for communion in the hand, for the iconoclastic remodeling of churches, and for the abolition of Latin and Gregorian chant. In fact, as we all know, the Council called for the preservation of Latin and Gregorian chant in the liturgy. Far from enjoying a pride of place in the liturgy, as the council demanded, one seldom hears the ancient chant of the church anymore. And certainly, nowhere did the council call for the liturgical abuses themselves, which have plagued a good portion of the church in the post-conciliar period. And yet, all these things were happening in the United States during the post-conciliar period. Such was the general state of the sacred liturgy of the Church in the United States as I began my studies in engineering at a state university in Michigan. Again, I emphasize my personal story because it is the general story for most of my generation. I had attended 12 years of Catholic school education prior to starting university studies. But that Catholic school education had occurred in the late 1960s through the late 1970s. And what I did not know about my Catholic faith, especially the Holy Mass, could fill volumes of books. With regard to the sacred liturgy itself, I honestly had no awareness of what was really happening in the Mass. I certainly believed in the real presence, although without a very profound understanding, I had absolutely no idea that the Mass was essentially a sacrifice, the sacramental representation of Christ's once-for-all sacrifice on the altar of the cross. I thought of it as more of a reenactment of the Last Supper, with great emphasis on the meal aspect of the Holy Eucharist. But then, as a young university student, I began to read about my faith. I began to get a hold of great resources, which I studied assiduously. I began to discover what I had not been taught. I began to discover the real meaning of the holy sacrifice of the Mass. First, from my parents' old hand missals, and then more scholarly articles and books. I came to realize that I had been cheated out of my Catholic heritage. I attribute no ill will to my earlier educators. They were all doing what I'm sure they thought was correct in the spirit of Vatican II, guided by the experts at the time. Nevertheless, I was discovering a whole new world, previously unknown to me. As part of my journey, I discovered the traditional Latin Mass. I was deeply moved by this discovery, and soon did all I could to learn about it. Now, when I say I discovered it in books and on videotape. Remember VHS videotapes? A Mass celebrated with the choir of the University of Mundelein, the seminary, a beautiful church, narrated in black and white by then the Right Reverend Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen. That videotape, as poor quality as it was, had a profound effect on me. This was also during a period when I was beginning to discern seriously a priestly vocation. As beautiful as I found this traditional form of the Mass, it was for me a thing of the past. I would never experience it myself. It had been relegated to groups which had rejected the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. In my mind, it had been lost to history, and for me, this caused great sadness. But I would simply have to let it go. I was ordained a priest, and I vowed to do all I could to celebrate the Mass well, as beautifully and reverently as I could, and according to the mind of the Church. But the sadness remained that I would never experience the usus antiquio of my church. I even remember being a little jealous of priests I knew who had received permission from their bishop to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass after Pope St. John Paul II allowed for the indult to celebrate the traditional Mass under Ecclesia Dei. Then, Summorum Pontifical was issued by Pope Benedict XVI, and my chance had come. I had been a priest for 18 years and a bishop for 2 years. I decided that since I was a bishop of the Latin Church, I should know both forms of the sacred liturgy. Groups of the faithful had asked for the extraordinary form of the Mass in my previous assignment as Bishop of Marquette, and their chief shepherd should meet their spiritual needs. In fact, I was the first to publicly celebrate the extraordinary form in my cathedral church. I wanted to send a signal that this should be an integral part of the life of the local church and not something on the margins. What I have found as a bishop since Pope Benedict XVI issued Summorum Pontifical is that many people's experience mirrors my own. I do not want to paint too broad of a picture, but it seems to me, at least in the United States, that there are two primary groups who have found spiritual enrichment and solace in the extraordinary form. There is, of course, an older group of faithful Catholics who grew up in the church with the traditional Latin Mass and who deeply appreciate its return. Some of these have worshipped over the years in parishes of the Society of St. Pius X or others, groups in an irregular canonical status. Others have simply worshipped in the ordinary form, but welcome this restored availability of tradition. But there is a very large group of younger Catholics in the United States who have discovered the extraordinary form and have been drawn strongly to it, as I have. There is certainly a group of my generation who lived at a time before the reform of the sacred liturgy, but who have no conscious recollection of the traditional Latin Mass. What fascinates me, however, is the large number of young Catholics who were born long after the issuance of the Missal of Blessed Paul VI, who now prefer to worship in the extraordinary form. Many of those young people are here. And they were in Rome during the pilgrimage Summorum Pontificum last fall. These are people who have absolutely no experience of the traditional Latin Mass, generally in their 20s, 30s, or 40s. They have discovered their Catholic heritage, and they have fully embraced it. One need only observe that there are 20 chapters of the Juventutem movement established or being established in the United States and Canada. I was speaking with one of my elder bishops in the United States, for whom I have a great respect and affection. And he was completely perplexed as to why all these young people are being drawn to the extraordinary form. He just could not understand why people who had never experienced the usus antiquior of the Latin Mass could like it or want it to be their primary form of worship. I responded that this is precisely the question that should be asked. What is it that so many young people were not finding in their experience of the ordinary form that they were finding in the extraordinary form? This might give us some real insights into what a new reform of the Roman liturgy might look like. In the end, this senior bishop expressed the sentiment that he wished the whole extraordinary form would just go away. This is not going to happen. The traditional Latin Mass has been freed from its exile, and there can be no turning back for those who have discovered this rich liturgical tradition. Another senior bishop I know once asked a small group of us bishops if we thought the reform of the liturgy had been a good thing or not. All of the bishops answered yes. But when it came to me, I said yes also, but I said it was a heavily qualified yes. I expressed that what the Council Fathers had asked for and what they had voted for is not what happened. Once the concilium began its work on the reform of the liturgy, things began to go astray from what Sacrosanctum Concilium had actually asked for. Many changes were implemented that were never called for by Vatican II, as I have already pointed out some of these. So, we ended up with a missal that many believe was not in harmony with what the Council Fathers had actually voted for. And with the actual practices that arose, it soon became clear that the Mass no longer resembled the ancient liturgy of the Church. With much of the experimentation that took place, coupled with liturgical aberrations and abuses, which crept in some places, there had been a rupture with tradition. In some cases, the liturgy of the Church was no longer recognizable from what had preceded the liturgical reforms implemented after Vatican II. In some isolated places, the traditional Latin Mass was still celebrated, but it was always with the granting of the indult of Ecclesia Dei and was restricted in its celebration, always requiring the permission of the bishop or a priest to celebrate under the usus antiquior. This was certainly true in the United States. There was the impression that the traditional Latin Mass had been forbidden, except in these indult cases. With the issuing of Summorum Pontificum by Pope Benedict XVI, the ancient form of the liturgy had been freed from its shackles. Pope Benedict clarified that the traditional Latin Mass had never been juridically abrogated, and its celebration had always been, in principle, permitted. It had not been simply relegated to be a relic of the past. One of his most powerful statements in Summorum Pontificum was this: what earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too. And it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. It behooves all of us to preserve the riches which have developed in the Church's faith and prayer and to give them their proper place. Unquote. Pope Benedict XVI had made clear that his purpose in issuing Summorum Pontificum had been to achieve an interior reconciliation in the heart of the Church. Many took this to mean that what was intended was to reconcile the followers of Archbishop Lefebvre and the Society of St. Pius X and similar groups. While this is partly true, it does not tell the whole story. What the Pope meant was that the Church herself needed this interior reconciliation, and not just those groups which had placed themselves in an irregular canonical status. All one has to do is read the full text of Summorum Pontificum and the letter of explanation which accompanied it. I can say that I have heard it from the mouth of the Pope Emeritus himself. During my Ad Limina visit in 2012, I asked the Holy Father about Summorum Pontificum, and he responded with vigor that he had issued the motu proprio in order to interiorly reconcile the Church with her past. There could be no reform of rupture, but a reform that would employ the hermeneutic of continuity. In his recent book, The Last Testament, which is an interview with the Pope Emeritus, Pope Benedict XVI was specifically asked if he had allowed for greater use of the extraordinary form as primarily a concession to the Society of Pius X. His response is clear and very revealing. And I quote him now, quote, "That is just absolutely false. It was important for me that the Church is one with herself interiorly, with her own past, that what was previously holy to her is not somehow wrong now. The right must develop. In that sense, reform is appropriate. But the continuity must not be ruptured. My intentions were not of a tactical nature. They were about the substance of the matter itself." Unquote. So, with Summorum Pontificum, the landscape of the liturgy in the Church has truly changed. This is certainly true in the United States. There are many new religious communities dedicated to the extraordinary form, and they are drawing large numbers of priestly and religious vocations among the young people who have been drawn to the traditional liturgy. One need only think of the priestly fraternity of Saint Peter and the Institute of Christ the King, Sovereign Priest, both of which have a significant presence in the United States. They operate in several dioceses. Some religious communities also celebrate according to a very traditional expression of the ordinary form, heavily influenced by the greater presence and celebration of the extraordinary form in the country. These communities are also experiencing a large number of vocations from among the youth. There is a growing number of the faithful who are asking for the extraordinary form in almost every diocese in the United States. I know this is true in my own archdiocese. As we say in America, it is catching on. Most bishops, including myself, are doing the best we can to respond to these needs. The challenge is to find priests who are willing and able to dedicate themselves to learning this form of the Mass, making it available to a growing number of the faithful who are asking for it. I would like to emphasize again that this growing interest in the extraordinary form is not just among the faithful who remember it and have an affection or attachment to it. There is a growing number of young people and young families who are discovering it for the first time, are being drawn to it, and who are becoming serenely attached to it as a means of fulfilling a deep spiritual desire of the heart. There is a particular interest in the extraordinary form among families who homeschool their children in the United States. An interesting thing happened recently as I was preparing to make this trip to Germany. A member of my archdiocese is part of a study group right now. Most of the members of the group are very liberal when it comes to many of the moral teachings and disciplines of the Church. This individual, my friend, is not. She says this is her Lenten penance. Yet, this group of people unanimously were of the opinion that the Church made a big mistake in getting rid of Latin and the traditional Mass. They miss it. So maybe converts to a more traditional liturgy will even come from surprising circles. Many seminarians in the United States are also interested in the extraordinary form. They seem to be attracted to the beauty, reverence, and prayerfulness of the usus antiquio. I have the impression that it also gives them a greater sense of priestly identity, which the extraordinary form certainly does. I have to tell you that when I learned the extraordinary form myself, nobody taught me. I bought books and videotapes. My first low Mass celebrated a long, simple burial Mass. It took me almost an hour, because I had to keep checking, what do I do next? But once I became comfortable with the extraordinary form, one of the thoughts that went through my head was, now I feel like a priest. Many seminarians are asking to be trained in the extraordinary form, and some newly ordained priests in the United States are even celebrating their first Mass in the extraordinary form. There are still, unfortunately, many priests and members of the lay faithful who are strongly opposed to the extraordinary form and who do not want to see it spread any further. I do not fully understand why they feel so threatened by its presence. One priest expressed his discomfort with my own appreciation of the extraordinary form, fearing perhaps that I was going to somehow impose it on everyone. I explained to him that I celebrate at least 365 Masses every year. And I can count on one hand the number of times I have publicly celebrated the extraordinary form. So where he gets this idea, I do not know. But I simply explained that I have to be the shepherd of all God's flock entrusted to my care. This includes those who have the legitimate desires to be spiritually nourished by the ancient liturgy of the Church. It is fully legitimized by Summorum Pontificum, and I need to care for them. In fact, people who have had these traditional liturgical sensibilities have long felt marginalized and forgotten in the Church. It is time that they had their proper respect and place within the body of Christ. In the end, there is no going back. The extraordinary form of the Mass is becoming more and more normalized in the life of the Church, at least in the United States. People have drunk from the deep well of the Church's liturgical tradition, and they will not be satisfied with anything less. As for the interior reconciliation in the heart of the Church that Pope Benedict XVI so desired by issuing Summorum Pontificum, there is much work to be done. It is my view that all future liturgical reform must be measured against the ancient form of the Roman liturgy. Pope Benedict spoke of a mutual enrichment between the two forms of the one Roman Rite. In any future changes to the ordinary form, the ancient liturgy of the Church must once again be recognized in the way the Church celebrates the holy sacrifice of the Mass. May the extraordinary form continue to flourish in the Church for the greater honor and glory of God and for the salvation of souls. Laudetur Jesus Christus.